Joe Stiglitz is pretty much a titan, certainly in my field. Nobel Prize winner in 2001. He was head of the Council of Economic Advisors for Bill Clinton. He was chief economist of the World Bank, and now he's a professor at Columbia. But he's used all that eminence the last few years, and even actually while he was inside the establishment, sometimes to launch quite a lot of attacks on the establishment. Not just, it ranged from the economic orthodoxy that was being applied in the Asian financial crises to that's been ongoing in the debate about globalization, and most recently taking the administration to task for its accounting for the Iraq war, and that's obviously what we're talking about tonight. I apologize on behalf of the front line that you're not able to buy this book here tonight, but if you could sort of imagine Amazon in the corner, sort of figuratively speaking, it's £20. I think it may even be reduced on Amazon. Very easy to get hold of. I got mine in about a day and a half. So.
Thank you.
I guess we should just we should start with the substance of the book, which is this enormous figure that you come up with for the long-term cost of the Iraq war, which is 2.7 to $5 trillion, which, just to put in perspective, the lower figure, or 3 trillion, is $25 billion a month, or $50,000 for a family of 5 in the US. Now, I guess the background to this is I remember Larry Lindsey, one of the president's advisors, coming out at the beginning of the war saying it would cost 20 billion. And sorry, no, it was 200 billion.
200 billion, yeah, and he was fired.
Yeah, he was fired, and Rumsfeld said that was baloney. Couldn't be as much as 200 billion. It would be 50 or 60 billion. And then there were in fact, Wolfowitz said it would pay for itself. The head of the Agency for International Development actually thought it would cost the US taxpayer 1.7 billion to build a democratic Iraq, which obviously sounded pretty cheap to everybody. Now the official figure is, right now, already spent 634 billion, but then there's more on the table that the president is asking for. And as you discover if you read Professor Stiglitz's book, the real number could be a lot higher than that. And I guess the question is, how do you get from even the 634 billion to 3 trillion?
Yeah, it's just basically simple arithmetic. The way we approached it is just to break it down, begin with the amount that we already spent. And you mentioned the basic numbers. One way to put it a little bit in perspective, let me just step back for a second, is we're spending $12.5 billion a month up front in cost. And it's gone up from $4 billion a month at the beginning of the war, and it's been going up steadily every month of the war. So it's expensive no matter how you calculate it. The amount that they say, which is now, say, $600–700 billion, doesn't include, though, lots of other things that are hidden in the defense budget. And so that's the first addition to the official counting that we include. In the last 5 years, since the beginning of the war, Department of Defense expenditures in the U.S. have gone up $500 billion. Just for those in England, you don't use the term trillion, but it's a million. It's just
4,000 billion.
It's a lot of zeros. So just in the last 5 years, it's gone up $500 billion over what was projected. And we argue that a lot of that has to do with the Iraq War. There's hidden expenditures in the Iraq War are attributable in one way or another to the Iraq War. The obvious example is it's very hard for us to recruit people to go into the armed forces. It's not exactly a picnic. And the way we've been treating our soldiers, without body armor, treating our returning troops, it makes Sally Oaks look very good, is discourage people from joining. We've we've been paying huge bonuses between $50,000 and $150,000 for people to join or rejoin, but that's not included in the Iraq budget. And even with that, the standards have been lowered Standards have been lowered. The fraction of high school graduates is gone down, and we've changed the basic qualifications. We now have a significant number of convicted felons in the armed forces. And one of the interesting aspects of it is that there are studies of productivity that have been done, like by the RAND Corporation, that show that education pays, and if you have people who are not well educated, not only don't they shoot well, they don't take care of the equipment, and every measure of cost goes up. So those are the upfront costs. And the next big item is what we're going to be spending for the next 60 years. And the one part of it depends very critically on how fast we disengage. There are a whole set of scenarios that the Department of Defense, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office put out, and we base ours on that. And there's not much of a disagreement over those numbers. But the two other, and there's another item, which is we put an enormous amount of military equipment there, and it's going to cost us a lot of money to bring it back, so that's called the demobilization cost. But the two big items are what I call resetting the military. The state of preparedness of our military equipment personnel is much lower than it was 5 years ago. Surveys of the military commanders say that we are much less prepared to meet any contingency. And so if you want to restore to the state that we had in 2003, it will cost several $100 billion. And then the most important chunk of money is caring for the disabled, disability compensation. And to put a frame around that number, to understand how big that number is, I don't know if you remember the short 100-hour war, the first Gulf War in Kuwait. We are now spending, in just providing compensation for the disabled for that 100-hour war, $4.3 billion a year. Wars are destructive of people. And in this war, we expect 40 to 50% of those 1.65 million already gone to Iraq will come back with disabilities. They're coming back with very bad disabilities. Just on invisible wounds, a recent report came out. Invisible wounds are post-traumatic stress syndrome, TBI, traumatic brain injury, and serious depression. They estimate about a third of those coming back will have invisible wounds, in addition to physical wounds. And the cost of treating these are very high, and because we haven't been actually spending money, the cost is likely to be higher than it otherwise would be. I mean, in these stakes, you often see homelessness that's very much related to the Vietnam War and the people coming back with PTSD from that war. We're now creating the next generation of homeless people in the United States. We estimate the cost of these healthcare costs and disability payments to be in excess of $600 billion. And to put get a sense of how big a number that is, the president went to the American citizens in a State of the Union message just 4 years ago and said our Social Security system is bankrupt. Our old age pension program for the public is bankrupt, and if we don't do something about it, it will be a disaster for our economy and for break the covenant, the contract with the elderly. For the unfunded entitlement that we have created for these disabled in the last 5 years, we could have, for that same amount of money, put the Social Security system on sound financial footing for the next 50, 75, or 100 years. So we're talking about a lot of money here. So those are the budgetary costs, except for one item, and that is interest. And this is the first war in America's history, probably any country's history, that has been put entirely on the credit card. Every cent was borrowed. When we went to war, we had a deficit, and the president, You know, usually you go to war, you ask your young men and women to fight, to sacrifice, risk their lives, and older people can't do that, but they're asked to share in the sacrifice by paying some increase in taxes. And there's a debate about how much to increase the taxes, how much to put on to the next generation. But every war, there's been an increase in tax. President Bush asked most Americans to sacrifice by going to the shopping mall. And so actually had a tax decrease, for a very large tax decrease for upper income Americans. And the result of that is it's been totally financed by borrowing. The first time since a very important war for us, the Revolutionary War.
Quite important for us, actually.
Okay. The Revolutionary War, some 225 years ago, was the first war that's been financed as much by foreign borrowing. Then we got it from France, this time it's from China, but it's 40% foreign borrowed, foreign financed. So the interest payments are large, and it's like buying a car on credit. The total payments can double because you've borrowed it. So those are the budgetary costs, which represent a little over half of the $3 trillion. But the other point that we did, and differs from what other people have done, is then we went beyond the budget and say, what are the costs to society that go beyond the amounts that are captured in the budget? And that was one of the reasons I originally got involved in doing this for a meeting of the American Economic Association, because my sense was it was probably the case that the budgetary numbers didn't capture all of the economic impacts. And those are two parts. We looked at the micro and the macro. On the micro side, with some intuition about this, that the amount that we're paying in disability and death benefits are just a fraction of the total value lost to the society of those deaths and disabilities. So just give you one example. In 1 out of 5 families in which there's somebody seriously disabled, and I say there are large numbers of people coming back with serious disabilities. In 1 out of 5, somebody in the family has to give up their job to take care of them full time. So that's an economic cost it's a cost to our economy. Somebody's not in the labor force. So we provide an estimate of that cost. The death benefit is $100,000 to the budget. If you've decided to buy death insurance, which many of these people, don't bother to do because the young kids, they don't, if you buy death insurance, you get another $400,000. But the basic death benefit is $100,000. Well, any calculation of somebody's lifetime income is much greater than $100,000. And the U.S. government and the UK government have a regular procedure for trying to value lives. It's an unpleasant task, but when you're doing a safety regulation or environmental regulation, you have to look at the cost of the regulation and the benefit is reduced number of deaths. And how do you value a life? And so there's a standard method. I could describe it later if we want, but the number that is used ranges from something like $7 million to about twice that number, $20 million. In the UK, the standard number is around 8 million pounds. Anyway, the number that we use in our book is 7.2 million. It's at the lower end of that. But that's a big gap between that and $100,000. So that's one example of the cost to the economy that goes beyond the budgetary cost. And then there are the macro costs, and these are, again, of two kinds. There's a short run and the long run. The long run is easiest to see, and in some sense, the money that we're spending in Iraq isn't increasing the productivity of the economy. And so there's an opportunity cost of what we could have done in terms of investment if we use those resources for education, highway, or anything else that would have our economy would have been more productive. The more, you say, contentious, the more the discussion is the link between the war and the current U.S. economic problems. And there's a lot of discussion, which is the most important issue in the U.S. election? Is it the war or the economy? In our book, we try to say those two are actually very closely linked. And if I can try to go through the link a little bit, very
sure.
quickly.
Or we can go, or we'll go back to. I will promise to go back to it.
Okay,
well,
if you want to go back to it, why don't we
yeah.
go back to that later? Because that is another big amount of the link that has played an important role in the weakness of the U.S. economy. And so, to go back to your original question, you just break it down. You add up you break it down into these pieces, and then it's simple arithmetic, and you add it up, and the numbers come out to be very big.
Did you, what was the discovery that was most disturbing? Obviously you've gone through this enormous list. It was very hard. The other thing that's striking is how difficult it is to get hold of some of these numbers, or at least you do have to do the Freedom of Information Act requests to get things out because they were not presented. I think one of your examples was the surge, the cost of the surge, yeah. and the number of troops that were being sent there didn't include any of the support officers or any of the other things that would be part of it. But what was the thing that sort of shocked you most, just in terms of how the costs add up, and some of the figures about the contrast between how much the poor sort of regular soldiers get versus what goes into the private contracts? Yeah. And
well, I guess the single I suppose the thing that most disturbed me in terms of, you might say, dishonesty was the number of people injured in this war. Because if you pick up a newspaper, and I look at the Herald Tribune, any newspaper, the number they report is about half the correct number. And that's because they go to the U.S. Department of Defense website and they take what they say for face value. And you look at the numbers, and it's very hard to interpret exactly, and they publish the number that they see on that website, not thinking that the U.S. government would be deliberately trying to, I want to say lie, but lie, yes. So when you look at the number of people that die, they are the total number of people who die, whether they die in combat or non-combat. When they report the number injured, it's only the number of people injured in what they define as combat-related injuries. So, for instance, if you get injured in the crash of a helicopter flying at night because it's too dangerous to fly in the day, that is an injury that could have happened anywhere in the world, and it's not attributable to Iraq. It's not in the Iraq statistics. Or if you have a convoy, and the first vehicle in the convoy hits one of these explosive devices, gets blown up, and somebody gets injured or killed, it will be called a combat-related injury. If the second vehicle crashes into the first vehicle, because the first vehicle has obviously stopped in a sudden way, that's just another automobile accident, and will not be listed in the page that all the press turns to. And so, as I say, the result of this is that, and we had to use the Freedom of Information Act, working with the veterans groups, to find out the total number that were injured, had to be evacuated. It's not just injured. There are a large number of people coming down with illnesses, in Iraq. It's not the healthiest place to be. So, and another scandal is that we've not been able, including the UK, to provide adequate sanitation. There's a cholera epidemic been going on, and our troops can't be totally protected against these kinds of diseases. So the point is that there are a large number of evacuees that don't return because of medical diseases. There's a really interesting story. My co-author Linda uncovered this particular piece, put it in paper that she wrote and got called up by the Undersecretary of Defense really angry and say, how did you find out this? And it had for a moment been on a website that the Department of Veterans Affairs put up. And of course the next day it wasn't there. So it's a deliberate attempt to deceive the American, it's not just an accident, it's a deliberate attempt for people not to see how many people have been injured.
Mm. I mean, the other thing that struck me, that surprised me most, I mean, we will get onto some of the other bits of your analysis, but it is surprising reading through, and there's a lot of stories like that, and also about the way that veterans are treated in the statistics, but also in a human way. And it's for a country that covers itself with flags and is so avowedly patriotic. It is, I mean, how is it that they are seemingly treating the sort of veterans and also just the regular soldiers so badly? I mean, you also talk about them some of the families having to buy body armor for the soldiers.
If they were well enough off, they can buy body armor. But if you're poor, you don't buy the body armor.
And you have to pay the Pentagon back if you hurt any of lose any of your equipment. If you lose a helmet.
Because you get blown up.
Even if you get blown up and you lose your helmet, the family gets a bill for the helmet.
Well, it was actually even worse than that, and some of this we finally, I mean, partly because of our book, got changed. One of the things I mentioned before that they had sign-up. This was not in the book, but I mentioned the high sign-up bonuses and the re-enlistment bonuses, and you re-enlist for 4 years. What happens if in the first month of your service, you get so badly injured, you lose a leg and you can't go back and fight? Well, the Army's view was you signed up for 4 years, you only served 1 month, therefore you have to give us back 95% of the enlistment bonus or re-enlistment bonus. I mean, this is behavior that any employer would do. That would be called up, well, fortunately, because of what we did and because of Congress has changed that. And they said, no, if you can't ask people to pay this back. I mean, that's just inhumane. I think the answer from you might call it the political economy of what's going on is very simple. A big difference between World War II and today is the volunteer army. In World War II, everybody and everybody's family was involved. Now it's mostly poor people, people in the South. It's regional and it's income related. There, some people at times you can call them economic conscripts. They have no other economic opportunity. I want to make clear there are a lot of people who do volunteer for patriotic reasons, who are really believe in the cause, but there are also some who see this as their chance to get out from the problems that they face. But because it is the smallest percentage of the population that's fighting in the armed forces, the groundswell of support is not what it otherwise would have been. We've kept the numbers down partly by using contractors, and the contractor numbers are going up. Hard again get the exact numbers, but we think that now they're in the range of between 100 and 200,000 contractors. So we're talking about as many contractors as there are actually
and they cost a lot more.
And they cost a lot more. It's one of the reasons the costs keep going up. So I think that's that's one of the reasons. One of the reasons that also has played a role, and a very unfortunate one, is accounting, our accounting system. The administration wanted to keep the apparent cost down. In the accounts, you don't see, remember, I talked about the $600 billion that are going to be spent for caring for the veterans. That's not on the books anywhere. Corporations have to use what is called accrual accounting, where you have to take into account deferred compensation. You have to take into account obligations that you're incurring today that you will have to pay in the future. The government doesn't do it. So all that anybody sees is, and what they own and report, are the 650 billion that they've already paid. They don't talk about the amounts that they've incurred in obligation. I mean, one government, New Zealand, has actually moved to accrual accounting, so it can be done. But both the US and the UK do not use accrual accounting. That leads to a political imperative to try to keep the upfront costs down and not spend as much money on the things, you know, even if it sounds cruel and unusual, it keeps the upfront costs down. And there are lots of other examples of that. One of the other things that we discovered, again through using the Freedom of Information Act with the veterans groups, was, you know, the president said he would do anything that generals asked for. But that was a lot of nonsense. We discovered that the commanders in the field asked for these special vehicles called MRAPs, which are mine-resistant vehicles that are designed to diffuse the kind of explosive devices. Had they used it, the number of people injured and killed would have been a fraction. And they've been known about for a long time. Southern Rhodesia was used in Southern Rhodesia 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So it's been well known, the improvement in technology since then. The commanders, we discovered, again, it's using Freedom of Information Act, discovered that they asked for it in early 2005. Rumsfeld refused to order a single one. And it wasn't until Gates became Secretary of Defense that in 2007 that the order was put in. So again, you know, how do you explain that? Well, the only explanation was their focus was to keep the apparent cost down, because an essential part of the Bush strategy, and it goes back to what I said earlier, was to try to persuade the American people that they could have a war for free. That it wasn't going to cost them anything in money. That was being put on the credit card. Somebody else was going to pay, and nobody would see it. And it wasn't cost them anything in blood, because it was a few volunteers and a few contractors. And so no bodies were shown coming back. No pictures were shown of the people in the hospitals. And so it looked like it was somewhere in outer, you know, it was not affecting the American people, and a deliberate attempt.
Just to get onto maybe some of the criticisms, or at least some of the things that have been said. I mean, I said to you earlier, when I read the coverage and when I had heard about the numbers, I had a lot of questions and criticisms, and I thought, great, I'll come along today and I'll give you more. But then you read the book, and actually you answer pretty much all of them, annoyingly, and you have. But it's also true that you say where there is a contentious thing. I mean, you're very clear about how the menu sort of stacks up, and if you don't like that one, you don't have to have that one, but it still adds up to 2.7 trillion, and you can take that out, but it still adds up to 2.5 trillion. I guess the bigger reaction I had, which sounds sort of crazy, but was in some sense it was sort of unfair to do this to Iraq and not to any of the other wars. I mean, I don't know whether you're aware of it, but it feels like nobody has ever done this for a war. I mean, really go through every conceivable cost. And so in some sense we have no way of comparing this to this number that you've come up with to the cost of past wars. I don't feel that I can necessarily say, other than it seems to make sense, that this is a more expensive war than past wars, because everyone has just looked at the much more transparent costs in the past.
There was another thing that's different about this war, and I think that was important in the background of this was a war of choice. You know, we didn't have to go to war. It wasn't like we were attacked. And there were some specious arguments put in both the United States and the UK about weapons of mass destruction. Hans Blix had really destroyed that argument, and so there was no credible argument about weapons of mass destruction, and clearly no credible evidence of an ability to deliver any weapons of mass destruction. So that argument didn't make any sense. The argument that there was a connection with 9/11, that was destroyed before the war and destroyed after the war. Al-Qaeda was not there. It is there now, but it wasn't there, we have to remember, in 2003. So there was no argument, no necessity for going to war. So it was a war of choice. And I think there is a sense in which you can think of this as a project. You know, and that's the second part of my answer. I think we ought to do these calculations more often. And one of the reasons we wrote the book is to say we ought to be thinking more about the cost, the opportunity cost of our defense budget. How do we want security, it's obviously important, but are we buying, we've been unquestioning about the largest chunk of of our spending. You know, 42% of the U.S. Government budget goes to war-related expenditures. That's huge. In a country where you know, poverty is increasing, education problems, 47 million Americans have no health insurance and when the president vetoed a provision to provide health insurance for poor children, which would have cost something like a few days of fighting. And he said we couldn't afford it. So in that context, how could you not talk about the economic cost? So my own feeling is this ought to be part of our discussion when we make our decisions about the largest chunk of where we're spending public money. We go in, you know, and we debate about welfare programs. Are we getting the best value for it? And what we're talking about, I mean, you know, I went through, when I was in the Clinton administration, we had a very big fight about welfare reform. And we were talking about an amount, you know, we were fighting, arguing, money being spent well. We were talking about an amount that is roughly a week's fighting of the Iraq War. And this was a major political issue, and it wasn't whether we were going to spend $4 billion or zero, about 4 or 3 billion. So what we were talking about huge fights over hours of what amounts to a few hours of fighting in Iraq. And on that depended on the well-being of lots of people in our society. So it seemed to me that we ought to get a sense of proportions of some of these issues, bring in this kind of reasoning into the ambit of discourse. Do you
worry at all that this kind of analysis will come back to haunt you, that it'll be applied to the next war of choice that's a humanitarian option, you know, operation, a UN operation, where it would be even clearer for people to say, well, we're going to face all these costs and possible injuries, and what's the benefit to the US economy? I mean, because the similar analysis could be used against the Somalia intervention or any of those.
My view is this is half the story, and there's the other half, which is the benefit. We are very clear that we are only talking about the cost. And people may come out on the side of saying the benefits were worth the cost. Our own view, and the reason we didn't go into evaluation of benefits, we couldn't see any benefits. But you know, and we quote some people on the other side. There was one guy at the University of Chicago who said, "Well, we were going to bring unprecedented prosperity to the Iraqi economy. They're still waiting for that." But we didn't want to get into those debates. But we said we should be at least able to agree on what the costs are. And then you can have a debate about whether you think that the benefits are worth the cost. My own feeling is, yeah, it would be it may come out with an answer that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think as part of good government, you have to be transparent about the cost. And I think this issue of transparency is really one of the big issues that in our book, that it clearly was a deliberate attempt to hide the cost. And that cost, that the attempt to hide the cost has increased the cost, both most poignantly to our soldiers, but also to our economy.
Because you end up with more injuries and all those things which would come out.
Exactly, and when you come back, you don't have hospital facilities like in Walter Reed. You just haven't, you know, the backlog. Just to give you another number, the backlog of at the Veterans Administration, people who are applying for health care and disability from the Veterans Administration is now 400,000. So there are 400,000 people who've left the military, qualified for veterans benefits, just told you have to wait. Can't even see a doctor, or can't even get benefits, which by law they're entitled to. And they'll get there eventually, but it will be months and months. And meanwhile, some of them will have their problems get worse. Some of them, there's a major suit going on in the United States. I don't know if you've been following this. Again, in the paperback that will be coming out in September, we point out some of these things. The suicides have gone way up, including suicides of those coming back from Iraq. And there is a very large class action suit going forward by the parents, wives, siblings, you know, of those who've committed suicide, not asking for compensation, but saying the government has to provide adequate health care treatment for those who are suffering from these problems.
There's a couple of more things I'd like to go into, and then I know that there'll be lots of questions, but one of them is this question of the economic impact. I mean, you're very transparent about it, but you make quite strong claims about how much of the Iraq War has contributed to the current economic weakness. One aspect is its contribution to the oil price rise, although you're only including a proportion of the big rise in the oil price, but you also talk about having attributed the weaker economy to the Iraq War, you then talk about weaker tax revenues and feed that into the cost. And you have a description of the Federal Reserve trying to sort of save the administration from the economic cost of the Iraq War, which I suspect the chairman of the Federal Reserve wouldn't recognise. But I mean, if you just talk us through how you think it's contributed to the current situation.
Sure. The main connection is the following. War spending doesn't stimulate the economy as much as other kinds of spending. You know, if you're hiring a Nepalese contractor to work in Iraq, it doesn't help the economy in the U.S. It may help Nepal, may help Iraq, but it certainly doesn't help the U.S. very much. It's a drain. But even more importantly, as you mentioned, the war contributed to the increase in the price of oil. In our calculations, we only assume $5 to $10 of the, by now, $115 increase in the price of oil is due to Iraq. We think that is grossly underestimates the role of the war. And the argument, again, is a simple one. Futures markets in 2003, looking forward for the next 10 years, understood that there will be an increase in demand from China, from other places, but they anticipated there would be an increasing supply from the low-cost providers, which are mainly in the Middle East, and therefore they predicted that the price of oil would remain around $25 a barrel for the next 10 years. And the war upset that equation, not on the demand side, but on the supply side. And that began the process of ratcheting up the price. And it's a more complicated dynamic, but that's the basic picture. So we include only $5 or $10, but when we were going through the calculations, we had a puzzle, because even $5 increase in price takes out $25 billion a year from the U.S. economy, money that's spent in the oil exporting countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, no, that isn't spent in America, and therefore weakens the American economy. A number of people had discovered this sort of, you might say, mystery, because you looked at the numbers and you said, what's going on here? In the 1970s, oil prices went up, and the economies and global economies in most parts of the world got greatly weakened. And you had a global slowdown. Didn't happen. And what was going on? Now, the answer that some people said, we're in a new world. You know, the laws of economics are repealed. Somehow we're spending more money on oil, but it's not hurting us. That seemed to me garbage. You know, it just didn't seem very persuasive. There is an alternative explanation that, interestingly, is very much like the explanation. If you looked around the world, there was one region in the 70s that did not go through a global slowdown from the increase in the price of oil, and that was Latin America. Now, how did Latin America avoid what affected most other parts of the world? It borrowed. It borrowed massively. And there was a particular vocabulary then called recycling petrodollars. But the simple answer was borrowing. What was the United States doing? Borrowing. Borrowing massively. 2006, we borrowed $850 billion from abroad. At the household level, what was going on? Borrowing massively. The savings rate in the United States.
That wasn't Iraq, though. It wasn't
Iraq.
Iraq.
I'll just finish. Right. The savings rate plummeted to zero. Now, what was going on? Okay, what I'm trying to describe, you had this big negative from Iraq, from the oil, and what was offsetting that was people borrowing. The borrowing was sustaining our consumption, and sustaining consumption sustained the economy. Now, where does the Fed fit into this? The Fed was acting in a very myopic, and in retrospect, but let me say this is not said with 20/20 hindsight. A lot of us said this at the time. It was acting, you might say, recklessly, and saying, we have a problem. The economy is not as strong as it should be. There's some other elements besides Iraq that contributed to it. The design of the tax cut in 2001 and 2003 also affected it because they didn't provide the stimulus to the economy that a better designed tax cut would have done. So I don't want to blame Iraq for everything. It's not. But it was a factor. So, but they're not dying. They don't care why the economy is weak. They're just responding to their responsibility, which is keeping the economy going. So how did they do that? A combination of a flood of liquidity and lax regulation. And the regulations were really lax, and they talked up the economy. When Greenspan was asked, is there a bubble? He said no, he's a little froth. When interest rates reached their low point, he told people, go out and take a variable rate mortgage. If you had taken out a variable rate mortgage 10 years ago, you would have been a lot better off. Yes, because nobody expected interest rates ever to go down to 1%. At 1%, there was only one way for them to go, and that was up. They said, oh, this is great, more people are owning homes. Yeah, for a few hours. What good does that do you? They lost their home and their life savings now. They were, I could go on and describe the scams, but the bottom line of it all was they needed that loose monetary policy and that lax regulation to keep the economy going as well. Otherwise, the predictions that we would have said of the increase in the oil, depressing economy, would have been apparent. But my view is we were living on borrowed money and borrowed time, and it was just a matter of time before a day of reckoning happened. The Bush administration hoped it would happen after November 2008, but like many things in this war, timing wasn't perfect, and it began to unravel in August 2007. And so that's the connection. Now there's one more connection, and that is the deficit financing has reduced our room for maneuver. And even Ben Bernanke, who was, remember before he became chairman, was President Bush's chief economic advisor, has admitted that this is the case, that with big difference between 2001 and 2008 is that in 2001 we went into an economic downturn, and one of the achievements of the Clinton administration was that it wound up with a 2% of GDP surplus, and that meant that it was in a position to do something. It didn't do the right thing, but it was able to do something, and doing something massively enough, even if it was not the right thing, had some effect. But now we are now expecting the economic, the deficit, 2008 to be at least between $500 and $600 billion. That's not the official numbers, but that's what most economists think it will be. Almost everybody now thinks that the tax cut that we had in February is just not enough. The impact of the tax cut has been twice offset by the increase of the price of oil since the tax cut was enacted. So if you thought the tax cut was going to work, you now have had an oil tax increase of twice that magnitude. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic about the economy, but also why I see the link between the war and the economy.
I suspect, in terms of how much of the oil price rise you attribute to Iraq, I suspect we could go back and forth, but I'd find it much more interesting than any of you would. So I think it's probably the right time to go out to questions. There's loads of issues, and as you've already seen, if anyone is interested in current things going on in the economics, the downturn in the US and situation here, US presidential campaign. I mean, Professor Stiglitz is also very good on those subjects as well. But there was a gentleman here who was the first, I think.
Yes, I'm maintaining a website where we keep statistics on these statistics, the grisly statistics. I just would like to know, you mentioned earlier about the suicides, and right now the rate of suicides in the United States from the veterans returning to the United States is roughly 18 per day. So by the end of this year, more suicides in the United States will occur than actually the fatalities during the war. So in this grisly statistics, I was just wondering how you accounted that, or how, what number you put to that. And is it maybe cheaper for the U.S. administration that these people actually commit suicide instead of continue to drain? That is an issue. And also depleted uranium. I understand from the statistics that roughly half of Iraq has been contaminated, and some areas where you have U.S. soldiers are also in the middle of a toxic soup. And I wonder if you took this into account, and what numbers, the numbers for Kuwait with depleted uranium, the cost thereof is staggering. So is this something that you looked at? And if I may ask Stephanie a question, why are the issues that we're discussing tonight not addressed at the BBC? The program that you work for, Nightline, has, to my knowledge, never addressed this. If you could please address that.
I think I'll stick with Stiglitz, although we have talked at various times. My former program, Newsnight, has talked about the cost of war quite a few times, and in fact, I've done something on Professor Stiglitz's calculation, so that's not true. But in answer to the suicide question and the depleted uranium, I guess we should have said that it's only cost for the US. You haven't.
Oh, I should have said that. This is only the cost for the US. So we have a chapter where we talk about the cost of the rest of the world, including a section on the cost to the UK, a section on the cost to Iraq. Anybody who looks at the numbers, and I'm sure your website probably talks about this, the numbers for Iraq are devastating. 4 million, more than 4 million refugees out of a population of 28 million. 2 million have left the country. Number of doctors are half of what they were 5 years ago. And that's one of the reasons, when you try to interpret the very large increase in the death rate, you can't really separate out who's violent and who's not violent death, which is one of, because if the doctor isn't there to take care of them, that is an indirect cost of a violent death. Mm-hmm. And the estimate of what is called the excess deaths, that is to say, you compare the death rate before 2003 and the death rate after, to good studies have been done, one published in Lancet and one in the New England Journal of Medicine, based on what they call epidemiological approaches, where you do a survey. Just through June 2006, so we're about half the way through the war, and 2007 was the most violent year of the war. One study showed it's 600,000 excess deaths, and the other 450,000 excess deaths. So we're talking about numbers between, by now, close to 1 million one way or the other. So, you know, the cost to Iraq has been absolutely huge. Depleted uranium is one of the factors that have led to a higher disability rates. And we, in effect, use those kind of disability rates from the Gulf War, first Gulf War, to project our current one. We, as we say, we think they're conservative. We were trying to get lower bound numbers. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think our numbers are an underestimate of the eventual cost to the war. And it's one of the reasons, as I say, why such a large fraction, at least one of the reasons why such a large fraction are coming back with serious, with health problems. One of the interesting, when we wrote the book, one of the things we wanted to do was to provoke a national discussion, conversation about the various dimensions of the cost of war. And I think one of the things we've done is succeeded in doing that. And so in a sense, I've been pleased when people have said, have you included this? And we say, no, we didn't. And that's just another example of a dimension in which we've underestimated. One of the things that we did not include, we talk about, but we didn't include, is the large number of suicides, and they've continued to increase, and we mentioned that in the afterward to the paperback that will be coming out. The net impact, remember, in the total cost, it may save on the budgetary cost if they die, but the total costs are still going to be even greater, because we look in the total cost at the cost of what their contribution would have been. Another example of an important example that we haven't included that's similar is large numbers of returning veterans are finding it difficult to adjust to life back in the United States, civilian life. Large numbers are committing violent crimes, winding up in prisons, and prisons are expensive. And so that's another dimension. You lose their productivity, but you then have to spend large amounts of money incarcerating them. And so that's another dimension of the cost that we don't include.
And why? Because there are a lot of questions, so if we try and keep them pretty brief, and then this gentleman here. Sorry, in the pink shirt.
Can I just ask, President to be Obama and Hillary Clinton have made commitments on healthcare reform. That's not going to be cheap. Are Democrats already calculating the magnitude by which they'll have to scale back financial commitment to Iraq in order to fund healthcare reform?
Well, I think the standard calculation that they put forward is that it would be paid for by increases in tax, or the way they put it is not renewing the increase in the tax cut for upper income Americans that were part of the 2001 to 2003 tax cuts. That's the way they're presenting. But I think the reality that is that we could get better defense, more security, with less spending by both removing ourselves from Iraq and restructuring our Defense Department. So yeah, it is an important issue that hopefully will be addressed by the next president.
Right at the back, gentlemen. Yeah, just there.
Paul Ingram, I'm Director of the British American Security Information Council. My guess is there's a whole bunch of different costs that you haven't included, because it's one of those things that it's impossible to actually find numbers on. But I really welcome your study, and I think it's a really important leap forward, not just in judging the costs of the Iraq War, but as you say, any future wars, to actually transform the way we approach cost-benefit analysis before these wars outbreak, rather than simply try to measure them in retrospect. So I really welcome that. But what I wanted to ask, or to bring up, is the fact that America is an open economy in a globalized world. So many of the costs that will be experienced by Americans are going to be indirect as a result of the costs on other people. You mentioned the costs on Iraq. Well, of course, there's an economy that the US is not going to be exporting to very much, and that's a cost on the American economy. You mentioned the increase in oil prices. That has an impact on the global economy, which means that Americans are not going to be able to export. And then there's also the reputation of America in the world, which is impossible in many respects to put a price on, but it does have a price. Europeans stop buying American goods. There are nebulous or very difficult things to put a price on here, but they nevertheless have an impact on the cost, and that leads me to just put a...
To the question?
The rider is there not a danger that by putting in these costs in a way that looks as if it's authoritative and yet underestimates the costs, you're actually falling into the trap of playing into the hands of those who would go to war because they say, well, it's worth the cost because it's only this much rather than the real cost?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. We try to be very careful about saying we're only picking up a fraction of the cost. There are lots of non-quantifiable costs, and that some of these non-quantifiable costs may be far more important than these quantified costs. I mean, just like we can't quantify the benefits necessarily easily, we can't quantify some of the most important costs, but at least we should be aware of those parts that we can quantify. So an example of that we talk about that's very much along the lines that you talked about and related to my longstanding concern about globalization, I say there are a lot of global problems. The solution of global problems requires a global consensus. Informing that global consensus, there's often an important role for the world's largest economy to take, and the leader in the largest economy to have important say. But the loss of credibility from the war has undermined our credibility in providing that kind of leadership, which creates a vacuum in solving problems of global warming or global financial system. And what's interesting is that that's a view that is, we give a very, very powerful quotation from somebody in Bush's side that feels that this has been one of the saddest parts of this venture, is that that has been among the real cost. It's been made worse, obviously, by the way the war has been conducted, and the violation of human rights at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. Obviously, that has undermined it even more, and that's why, in many ways, I think the outcome of this election in November is so important, because I think it can reverse some of that damage.
Yeah, the gentleman on that side has been waiting for a while.
Name is Kavi. Professor Stiglitz, is it not the case that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have provided or rather have proved to be the driving engine of the economic growth that we have seen in Europe and America? And how do you suppose if by a miracle the Iraq and Afghanistan adventures were to come to a stop now, do you see our economies surviving, or will they collapse?
Yeah, well, one of the issues that we dealt with in the very first issue we dealt with in this chapter on the impact on the economy was to try to dispel the view that is widespread that wars are good for the economy. Our view was very strong that wars are bad for the economy. And the view that wars are good for the economy is a view that's understandable. It grew up in World War II because the view was that World War II helped the world emerge from the global depression. But at least since the time of Keynes, we know that we can stimulate the economy in ways that provide long-term increases in living standards, increased productivity. Wars don't do that. They actually, it's money down the drain. I mean, Keynes talked about you could pump prime the economy by digging holes, but you might as well pump prime the economy by building roads or educating people or doing research. So in my mind, the argument that we needed the war for our economy is totally wrong. But what is true is that there are some winners from wars, and they're all and they are part of the constituencies of war. They are the war party, if you want to think of it that way. The big winners in this war are two groups, and only two groups: the oil companies and the defense contractors. And the defense contractors have done very well. Halliburton stock is up almost threefold. You know, and you asked me, Stephanie, before, you know, what are the scandals? The other big set of scandals are the contractor scandals, which just keep coming on. I mean, there are some legal cases now that are addressing small bits of this. Oh yeah, and they just, you know, unfortunately the Democrats got control of Congress, and they've begun to have some hearings that bring out some of these things out in the open. But you know, usually, and this shows you the difference between this war and other wars, typically profiteering during a war is not viewed as with social approbation. You know, it's sort of, you know, when young people are going out and risking their lives for other people to walk off with big profits is viewed as among the worst possible things that one could have imagined. This war, profiteering is part of the way of life. And you know, Blackwater, you know, there's a whole set of companies who've done very, very well by it. One of the things that we argue in the book is that not only has it cost us financially a lot, but it's also undermined our mission. An example that we gave was that in the beginning of the war, right after we won the military victory, there was no doubt about our winning the military victory, we were very much aware we had to win the hearts and minds of the people in Iraq. Unemployment soared to 60%, and yet the contractors came in, and rather than hiring Iraqis, brought in Nepalese and Filipinos because it was cheaper. Their objective was not to win the hearts and minds. Their objective was to maximize profits. And you know, this is a clear case where profit maximization is not the same as welfare maximization in a broad sense. And so the consequence was that in this critical period, we engendered a lot of resentment, especially since some of the money was actually Iraqi money going to hire Nepalese. You could imagine with that kind of resentment. But question about, you know, the global impact, even in the countries where we were hiring their contractors, there's anger. I had a meeting a few weeks ago with the member of the cabinet of Philippines who was responsible for making sure that their Filipino workers abroad are treated well. I mean, they have a lot of workers abroad, and the government takes seriously the responsibility that their citizens are protected. And they don't want their Filipinos to be working in Iraq. And you could understand it. It's not a safe place. But there's another reason, which is they don't want their Filipinos to be kidnapped, held for ransom, including the ransom not only money from the government, but also letting out some terrorists in the Philippines prison. And so that puts them in a terrible political bind. You know, if they let them out, there's a problem. If they don't let them out, there's a problem. And so they say, they stamp their passport not valid for Iraq. Wow. And then they discovered 7,000 Filipinos are working in Iraq, going through U.S. checkpoints. U.S. government knows, you know, you go into Iraq, you have to go through a U.S. checkpoint. They know that they're violating Filipino law. But our concern is not, is simply minimizing our cost. Just one more example, because they discovered that Halliburton, many of the contracts of Halliburton operate out of the Cayman Islands. So they don't have to pay Social Security and Medicare. The Department of Defense knows that they are avoiding taxes, but they say, well, we're saving a little bit of money. Of course, the taxpayers are going to pay, you know, they're going to get Medicare, they're going to get, you know, the view is, well, why doesn't everybody else go through the Cayman Islands to save taxes? I mean, you were working at Treasury. What mindset has the U.S. government encouraging people to operate out of Cayman Islands to avoid tax pay, to deliberately encourage tax avoidance? I mean, it's a new mindset and these keep coming up.
Under every rock. Okay, so there's one guy in the front here. I might actually take two or three because I know we're going to end up with a backlog. So I'll take this gentleman here and one here afterwards.
Okay, this might sound painfully naive, but there's a phrase: if you owe the bank £1,000, then you've got a problem. But if you owe the bank £1 million, then it's the bank's problem. You talked about, I think, was it 40% of the funding of the war was borrowed money from China, did you say?
Largely from China, but money is fungible. You can't. But right now, yeah, okay.
And I guess another way of putting it is, if you owe lots of money to a mafia don, then you've got a big problem. But if you're the mafia don, what is your problem? So in terms of the question on borrowed money that the United States owes, how does the political reality of US might impact upon the future of paying back?
If we just get the mic, then to this gentleman here.
Professor Stiglitz, I was just wondering whether there was any mindset in the Bush administration to the extent that continued engagement could somehow serve to recoup the huge expenditure that's been made, that we've lost so much money in our engagement in Iraq so far. Is there some sense that continuing our presence there will enable us to recoup this rather than cutting our losses now and leaving?
If we just get the mic back to the very back again. I think there's an economist phrase that sunk costs are sunk. You shouldn't worry about them once they're sunk. This gentleman here.
Robert Fox, quick three-parter, and it's all related to the law. How much was the malpractice of 2003 in the whole enterprise emanating from the episode of 1990 and 1991, which was a botched war in its conclusion? Two, how have you managed to navigate the jungles of law and accountability of things such as non-compete contracts? Could you say a little bit more about that? And the bastard half-brother in this country, the urgent operational requirement, which we find very, very difficult to trace through the Treasury and MOD expenditure. And finally, how much do you see the whole thing now, as you have been very eloquent up to now, as a predicament of law? That the Americans will not have a United Nations Security Council resolution underpinning them from the 31st of December, and they don't seem to be getting anywhere with the status of forces agreement.
Okay. I better yeah, that's a good question. Okay, let me. The problem, the debt is a problem. And it's a long-term economic. It's becoming a long-term economic problem for the United States, partly because as outsiders see the increase in the U.S. debt, of which the Iraq War is part. I don't want to say it's all. The U.S. national debt stood at about $5.7 trillion when Bush became the president. It will be over $9 trillion when he leaves. But that doesn't include the debts that will be accumulating because of the Iraq War over the next, in the coming years, which will probably add another $1.5 trillion to that money alone. And that assumes that we could achieve balanced budget very quickly. If we don't, which we won't, I mentioned we'll have another $500 billion this year. Those deficits keep getting larger, and that puts the U.S. in a quandary. On the one hand, it's contributing to the lack of confidence in the U.S. economy, U.S. currency, weakens the dollar, and that brings with it inflationary pressures. That brings with it threats of higher interest rates. That brings with it a slowing down of the economy. So it has an economic impact on the U.S. economy. The other response is that we will have to, spending more money to service the debt means we have less money to spend at home. Less money to buy health insurance for poor people, for poor children. So in either way, or in both ways, it imposes a cost. I don't think anybody thinks that we will directly renege on the debt, or that China would decide to pull out its money. I don't, that is not the kind of scenario. But what the kinds of scenarios that people are worried about is that with so much debt, there's an incentive to inflate it away by allowing a little bit more inflation over many years, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a strong incentive for China to gradually take money away, which is contributing to a weaker and weaker dollar. So those are the kinds of, I don't anticipate a sudden event, but there is a kind of hostage problem if we got into a real economic war with China. It could do things that would be very disturbing to American financial markets.
Sorry, just quickly, how much is being borrowed from Saudi Arabia?
I don't know those numbers, but
it's more now than it was, I think.
Yeah,
because all of those petrodollars are going back into the US. Yeah,
but China's reserves are now $1.5 trillion, and about 3/4 of those are estimated to be in dollars. But they like Saudi Arabia and other countries are very aware that dollar is a shrinking asset, and putting money in T-bills, especially when it's low interest rate, is a bad investment. And so some of what you've been seeing in sovereign wealth funds is ways the governments are looking for taking their reserves and getting higher returns in dollar assets than holding T-bills. So, and that's bringing up a whole set of new controversies about to what extent is the American economy going to be controlled by other governments or other outsiders. Let me
the withdrawal one, I think, is because we haven't really got onto that. This idea of how much, if we put all this money in, is there a view that says the last thing we should do is now give up when so much money has already gone into it?
Yeah, the way economists typically think about this is the sunk cost, bygones are bygones. You should look forward and ask the question. I think from the point of view of the Bush administration, which is where the question began, I think that there is a lot of the phenomena that's in organizational literature talked a great deal called escalating commitment, and we talk about that in one of the chapters of the book. That is to say, while every economist says bygones are bygones, experience is, in general, people can't think that way, and the more they sink, the more they want to sink more, especially when it's somebody else paying the price. So President Bush sees his reputation being salvaged if things come out well, and if they don't, it's the American taxpayers and these young guys who are sacrificing their lives who pay the price, and he's not paying the price. You know, graphically, one way of thinking about this issue is if you go to Washington and you look, there's a Vietnam Memorial, list everybody who was killed in Vietnam by year. And think about, we knew when Nixon became the president in January 1969, that the prospects of the U.S. winning in Vietnam were very low. And it was clear we ought to have withdrawn then. Draw a line there and you say everybody killed after that are people who died unnecessarily. If we had withdrawn, these people would not have died. Well, we're talking about a very large fraction of those who died in Vietnam. And we're very much going in the same way, I'm afraid, in Iraq. There is very little reason to believe that, by the way, I don't think anybody thinks of our being able to recoup the dollar investment. You know, there was a little bit of naive thinking, very naive thinking that relates to your question. The Bush administration did not understand international law at the time the war began. I mean, they violated the international law in going to war, but there was another piece. Many people thought we went to war for oil, but they didn't know about international law that says that we're in the 21st century, not the 19th century. In the 19th century, when you won a war, you got to own the country and its resources. They were yours, and they were part of the spoils of war. Well, the Hague Convention says if you're an occupying power, you become a fiduciary. You have to act on behalf of the citizens of that country. That means you can't take that. You have to even be more careful than you were before. At least if it was the Iraqi government, you could bribe them. Now we, as a custodian, we couldn't do that. So, and I give a quote here in the book. When the guy that Bush sent in to privatize so much of Iraq was asked by somebody, are you aware that you may be limited in doing that by international law? He said, a swear word, I won't, international law. You know, I was told by George Bush to privatize, and that's what I'm going to do. You know, who cares about international law? Well, that's a mentality that was very strong in the Bush administration. But the reality is that he couldn't do it. Why? Because the people who might have bought it, you know, if you buy stolen goods, you have problem dealing with them in international markets because the next guy says, I'm not going to buy it because it's stolen good. Well, the same thing, nobody wanted to buy Iraqi oil if we weren't authorized to sell it. So the privatizations have not gone through. And so I don't think anybody ever thought that we would ever be able to, I mean, anybody outside of a small group in the Bush administration ever thought we were ever going to be able to recoup the financial investment. But the question is whether we can win in Iraq. And the big issue most people say is, what do we mean by winning? Right now, we've lowered the goalpost to say, well, can we make sure that it won't be chaos when we leave? And the answer is no. And the argument that we put forward in the book is the way you should put the question is not whether there'll be peace, whether there'll be things are better when we leave, which most Iraqis believe, or get worse. But the question is, will it make how much difference will it make if we stay another 4 years? And is the probability of making things significantly better worth spending another $1.5 trillion? So you need to think about it in this intertemporal context. What are you buying for another 4 years? You know, it's a crude way of putting it, but I think that's what it is. And if you say the probability of a significant improvement is relatively low, then you say, well, you know, could we spend $1.5 trillion to get more security, or lots of other things, better? And I think the general consensus, even among military people, is increasingly, yes, we can find it better ways. Now, on the issue of international law, let me just, and domestic law, let me just mention a couple of things. One of the things that we end the book with a whole set of recommendations of changes in our legal frameworks, accounting frameworks, that we think would reduce not eliminate the risk of this kind of thing happening again, but reduce the likelihood and reduce the magnitude of the disaster. One of the things that has contributed to the problems are the single sole source contracts. And sole source contracts are contracts where you don't put them up to competitive bidding. You understand why you might do that in the heat of the war, but not, they were giving contracts for 7 years, you know, to Halliburton. And they were, say, non-compete, sole source contracts. Even worse, many of them were cost-plus contracts. So the more they spent, the more money they made. But to make things worse, the Bush administration cut down on the number of auditors. So you have sole source, cost plus, and no audit. And
did you include the saving on the auditors? Did you take that off the cost?
No, we didn't. But the Bush administration made a big emphasis on that. But it was clear now that that was a small ratio of the extra cost but there is, again, one of these scandals that came out and not been reported as far as I know besides in our book, but is that a conflict between Congress and Rumsfeld over the sole source is one of the reasons the war hasn't gone, the Reconstruction went so badly, and the war insurgency. Congress insisted on the contracts being put out to competitive bidding. Rumsfeld insisted that they go to his friends in Halliburton. Congress said if you don't, you cannot sign a sole source unless you certify to us that there's no alternative, that you know. Rumsfeld said I can't do that, and said I'd rather not do any bidding, any contracting. So there was an $18 billion allocated for Reconstruction right after the war, after the victory and only $1 billion was spent. And the reason in part was that they were caught up in this corruption, what I view as a corruption scandal. And we are now paying a very high price because that's when the electricity wasn't put in, when the sense that things were going worse, fed the insurgency, and now began the dynamic that led to the disaster. The last issue that you raise is a very important one, which is not been, the complexity has not been sufficiently drawn attention to. The UN mandate for our being there is about to expire, and we have been trying to negotiate a agreement with Iraq. Big conflict within the United States is many people in the U.S., including U.S. Congress, want whatever agreement to be ratified by Congress. The Bush administration does not want it to be ratified by Congress. The question is, if it's not ratified by Congress, what legal status does it have within America? So that's one side. that what authority does a president have to commit another president? If it's not ratified, the next one can say, well, sorry, he didn't have the authority to do that. So there's a real question about what the future will bring. But while we've been debating about that issue, Iraq has taken over and says, we don't want to have an agreement on your terms. And because the politics in Iraq, they're concerned about their sovereignty. And we want, and one of the reasons that they're so concerned is that the U.S. has built a large number of very big bases, some of the big, I think the biggest bases in the world, which have led many people in Iraq to believe that we have intentions of permanent occupation. The question is, why would you spend that much money if you were just going to be there for a few years? So the Iraqis are responding, saying, we don't want you there permanently. They're afraid that if they allow them there with any kind of loophole, they will use that as an excuse for a permanent occupation. And while they have an imperfect democracy in Iraq, the voices against the opposition are sufficiently vocal, including marches in the street, that it isn't clear whether there will be an agreement. And the question will be, what happens if there is no agreement? And with Bush's power in the United States diminishing very quickly, and with these problems in Iraq, I think it is an interesting question about what the legal state is. And I'm not enough of a lawyer to know what happens if that stalemate continues.
We might be able to continue this more informally if you're very lucky, but in the meantime, thank you very much, Joe Stiglitz. I think the lesson from all this is, the next time anybody wants to plan a really expensive war, make sure you're doing something else. But thank you very much.